hello everybody. Thanks again for coming. As a resident, a Colorado resident, I'd like to officially welcome you to our fantastic state. It's always a really great honor for me to present. I think this is my 5th time presenting, and I'm especially excited this time that I get to present with my good friend and colleague, Jackie. So, as John said, we're going to talk a little bit about how we can create those emotional connections. I think what we're starting to see come through this morning is that building that emotional connection is really, really important when we think about building performance media campaigns. And we're going to talk to you a little bit about that today. We'll start kind of at the higher level, and then we'll boil that down to some of the things that Jackie and I are working on every single day. So one of the things that I think is really, really powerful, and one of the things that I think is starting to come through the morning sessions, is just what we're experiencing through the ongoing proliferation of connectivity is the democratization of knowledge transfer. When I was growing up, in order to learn something, I had to go to school, I had to go to college, and there was these very obvious places where you had to go to learn more. And now, because of connection speeds and connected devices, we're able to learn much more in many, many different ways. And this is one of the leading factors in creating the expectation economy. So when we think about the expectation economy, we really define that as a group of hyper-aware, hyper-informed consumers that really oftentimes know more about the products they're going to buy at a website or in a store than the people actually selling those products, because we are so connected and informed. And that has really created what Jeremy mentioned this morning, is that world of perfect competition. So for us as brands, we're no longer competing against just the other brands in our category. We're competing against best-in-class experiences wherever those experiences come up. Best-in-class products whoever makes those products. And the instant that one of those products or services is created, that's the expectation every single consumer has. And so for us as marketers, it becomes a real challenge for us to start to have to meet those expectations at every point in the journey. And as Jeremy said, as Jeremy Kornfeld said, as Jeremy Hull said, the really wonderful thing though about all of this, about the democratization of knowledge transfer, about the growth of the expectation economy, is that it has never been easier for us to connect with our audiences. There's more connection points than there ever has been. Just to put this in context, there's 100 million hours of how-to videos now on YouTube. 100 million hours. How-to searches have increased over 140% over the last couple of years. I'm not going to confirm or deny that I may have looked up one of these this morning as I was putting my tie on, but actually, I was comforted to find that the number one how-to search on Google is how to tie a tie. So definitely not. The second one is how to kiss, which I think is, I'm not going to comment, but
Google
seems like it's a natural thing.
Demographics from Google on that search. I wonder, middle school kids?
The other thing I found is particularly interesting is that there's 300 million active Instagram story users today. 300 million people just using Instagram stories, and 70% of those videos are watched with the sound on. Which is a huge behavior shift for me. And just to think about the context of 100 million hours of how-to videos, 300 million people posting stories, all of those represent really relevant and really personalized connection points with consumers. And those are things that didn't exist one or 2 years ago. But despite the fact that we have all this availability to us, we can reach consumers whenever and wherever, it's still a struggle. And we look at the top 50 brands, or 50% of the top 100 brands aren't growing or are shrinking in size because of this. So it's still a challenge for us as brands to make those connections. And so it really is true that it's never been easier to connect with consumers, but it's never been harder to make them care. It's really, really difficult for us to break through all that clutter and get people to pay attention to what we want to tell them. Fewer than 1 out of 200 people post about brands on Facebook. Fewer than 1 out of 200. So, people aren't talking about that. Loyalty is a myth. I was reading an article this morning, we as marketers have created a myth around loyalty that it exists. What really exists is convenience. Only 27% of purchasers are going to buy a product a second time. Only 27%. We default to convenience. Whatever is easiest for us at that moment is what we're going to go and purchase. And so as we think about the expectation economy, the fundamental challenge that we face as marketers is capturing attention. How do we get people to care? How do we get people to just think about what we're trying to tell them and change their behavior as a result of that?
And so we start to think about consumers and how their behaviors change over time. And it's true that the traditional mass means of reaching them are no longer cutting it. So I come from actually a very traditional background. I grew up in comms planning and traditional media back in the day I bought some TV. And putting this slide up here, seeing how time spent with digital has grown so rapidly, it has outpaced the other more traditional channels. And then you think about something like the TV upfront, super relevant. We're last week in New York City. And a lot of different publishers are publishing articles talking about this. The average age of a TV viewer has increased and increased over time. Ratings are dropping. You think about Roseanne, which was the top rated show this past season, and the average viewer age was 53 years old. Stop and think about that. Historically, we default to these mass means of reaching consumers because we know it works. You garner quick reach, it pays off. But then you think about consumer behavior, it's just not cutting it anymore. How are we going to reach those younger consumers, and how are we going to capture their attention? And this is something that could be incredibly complex, but it also presents new opportunities for us. So one of the things we can think about, and I am guilty of this, is when we sit in front of our TVs, we're on our phones 90% of the time. My other half jokes that he can't watch shows with me because I'm on Instagram the entire time looking at dog videos. But as brands, how can we start to capitalize on that as brands? Can we align our messaging when we know our core consumer, our core demographic might be watching TV and our ad might be served in an addressable manner on TV? Can we align our messaging? Can we work with a partner like TVTY to sync up our search presence? Another potentially overwhelming opportunity is realizing, yes, all these consumers are in digital, but the plus side to that is we can understand consumer behavior a lot more. Whereas we might have defaulted to proprietary studies or to market research to understand how consumers report their behavior, now we can understand their true and actual behavior, and we can create more personalized experiences to them based upon this. And then as we think about the adoption of technology, how can we start to link the physical and the digital, especially from a commerce perspective? It's no longer e-commerce versus in-store, it is commerce across the board. So how do we leverage technology and this consumer behavior in our favor? So what does this all mean? We need to change the way we're thinking about things, right? We need to get ahead of it. And rather than using mass influence, we are shifting to this idea of subtle influence. Instead of buying on reach and frequency and hitting the consumer over the head with messaging, how are we reaching them in a very choiceful way, in a one-to-one type of conversation with the right message in the right time, at the right place, on the right device? And so I love this chart. When I was initially onboarded into iProspect, this is one of the charts I saw in many of our pitches. And it's a chart that's in a pitch that I truly believe. You start to think about the power of reach and frequency and the old ways of media we used to work, and it's no longer relevant. I truly, truly believe in this. It's relevance and relationships that matter. When you think about our consumers being messaged in all different ways through all different technology, they're not going to pay attention unless it matters to them, unless it's relevant. And if you can serve them relevant messaging and start to build a connection, then you can start to build that relationship, which truly, at the end of the day, is what's invaluable.
And so when we think about this in the context of the expectation economy, and we think about that battle for attention, it becomes really clear that experiences are the currency that we have to operate in as marketers, that we have to start shifting away from thinking about things as singular channels and start to think of holistically, how can we create media experiences across the top of the funnel and across the bottom of the funnel that really start to connect with consumers, capture their attention, and ultimately change their behavior, leading to that tangible business outcome that we want more than anything, so that we're still achieving that, building the brand, but also selling products and building and moving the business forward in a seamless way.
Love this slide.
So as we think about that in the context of the journey, we've had a lot of conversations around the journey, and it's really interesting to me as a strategist that consumers don't think about the journey. Consumers don't understand that they're considering a product or that they're loyal to a brand. They just want that product or to find the bathroom if they need it. And it really doesn't matter how we construct the journey, whether we're looking at it from a sort of a traditional funnel as we go from awareness to consideration to sales, or if we try to get more complex and map out these really, really complicated journeys. It's really no longer about that. It's really understanding where that individual person is and how we can connect with that individual at that specific moment in time with a message that's going to make their life just a little bit easier or a little bit less complex. And in that model, what we're starting to see is a merger of brand and performance. One of the other things to come out of the expectation economy is that traditional boundaries between all things are starting to change and erode. And that's never more true than it is with brand and performance media. What was traditionally brand media is starting to look a lot more like performance media. It's more measurable, it's more tangible. And what we're able to do with performance media is changing pretty dramatically. If you think about the power of social and the power to connect with individuals, you're starting to see that brand and performance are coming together pretty seamlessly, and we have to start thinking about that as we build media plans. So what are we starting to do? What are the implications for that as marketers? We wanted to kind of start to boil this down to some really tangible things that we can start doing every single day to start building these holistic experiences, capturing attention, and still driving performance at scale.
And so, like every presentation, there are some key takeaways, 3 simple things we want to start to think about as implications, and then we'll move into what does this actually mean to you guys? What are actions that we can take together? Because Sam, there's nothing like a great presentation and inspiration, but you have to be able to bring it down to our level. It has to be able to bring value in our day-to-day. So the 3 big implications that we want to talk about right now are number 1, thinking holistically. Number 2, understanding the fact that personalization truly starts to meet consumer expectations. And then number 3, understanding this idea of a value equation. So let's jump into thinking holistically.
Okay.
There it is. So as Jeremy mentioned this morning, and he nodded to something that Nick says quite often, is how do we think about the consumer journey in a much simpler way? How do we get rid of all the complexities of the funnel, the traditional marketing funnel, or, is it linear? Is it a bow tie? What shape is this? Let's forget about that. Let's think about what we're doing in our day-to-day, right? We want to sell something to consumers ultimately. Sell, click, whatever the end goal might be. But rather than really focusing on this journey, how do we boil it down in a simplistic manner? And how do we think about we can bring new consumers into the brand, and then we can retain the ones who truly love the brand and continue to grow that relationship over time to derive more value. All the while, we're measuring this, we're pulling data, we're looking at analytics and being able to kind of feed that back into the process and truly create this flywheel. I was really surprised this morning when I didn't hear our Amazon speaker speak about the flywheel. It's something that they talk about quite often that really resonated with me in the past, and it's how do we think about this continual perpetuation of things and businesses kind of self-sustaining? How do we think about our media and our activations as a bit of this flywheel? So I love the simplicity of this because it truly, in a simple visual, paints that picture for us. And what does this mean to us in our day-to-day? How are we thinking about holistic planning across this journey, across this experience? It's moving from this narrow focus on advertising to a much broader focus on business growth. We are here to help you solve your business challenges and drive value in that way. How do we move away from siloed media executions, just thinking about search or just thinking about social, to a connected consumer experience? What is that journey? What is their ecosystem with a brand? How are we visualizing that and truly putting ourselves in their shoes? Moving from this idea of brand first, which might have been something that resonated, 5-10 years ago, to truly consumer first, which you'll hear us talk about quite a bit, but something we truly believe in. Moving from proxies to people, I'm sure this is something you all have heard of. Instead of this cookie-based world, how can we leverage something like M1, which we truly believe in, and actually target in a one-to-one way, but also use that data to understand more about our consumers? And lastly, how do we kind of shift the dialogue from just paid media to thinking about that full ecosystem of paid, owned, and earned? Whilst we might not touch all those pieces of our client business, it's so imperative to have that conversation, to talk to the creative agency, to understand what PR is doing and what marketing are doing, and start to figure out what does that journey look like, what are potential barriers that we might face in terms of getting through to that consumer, and how do we overcome them with media and with these relationships we're building.
So the next thing that we want to talk a little bit about is just personalization. It's something that's come up a lot. We know that personalization works because personalization helps meet consumer expectations. Consumers expect brands to talk to them on a one-to-one level, and it pays off in terms of tangible business outcomes. So we know that if we can deliver a personalized message, it can increase in-store purchases by almost 5%. It's part of the reason why we're so excited about the LFX platform. It's part of the reason why we're so excited about M1 and all the capabilities we can achieve through M1, because we know that personalization works in terms of not only changing behavior, but also driving those tangible business outcomes, why we're all here today to sell more product. The other thing is that consumers demand it. If 80% of consumers feel strongly about personalization, 90% of them are willing to trade more data for a personalized media experience. If we're not driving personalization, we're going to not meet their expectations, and they're going to find that level of experience somewhere else. So personalization is a core element of everything we have to do within the expectation economy, and now we finally have the tools and services to help us get there.
And then lastly, it's thinking about this value equation.
Oh, sorry.
If that's
I've got the clicker.
So again, back to consumer behavior and putting ourselves in the consumer's shoes, because truly we are consumers. We think about how we're inundated with messaging day in and day out. Personal example, my mother got quite upset at me for not replying to a text message. Are you in Denver? Are you all right? Are you in Colorado? Where are you? And I said, Mom, listen, I got a text from Bloomingdale's this morning. I got an update from Instagram texted to me. I've got over 100 unread emails, and that's just from the last week, and that's not even work emails. So this overload of content is so real, it's so tangible. 2.8 million emails sent every second. You've got 60 minutes of content uploaded to YouTube every second. I know my Googlers in the back corner are very happy about that. 2 million blog posts created every day. Instagram, I think I was reading something like 59 million posts per day. Again, I wonder how many of those are animal posts. But the truth is, we are so overwhelmed by this content being fed to us that consumers are starting to say no. They're starting to put their hands up. And this stat we found together, 68% of consumers say they are annoyed by the way brands continue to rely on an old-fashioned way of messaging and remessaging, and like I said earlier, hitting them over the head. This just doesn't work. In this time where consumers are faced with choice, they can decide what they tune into, what messaging they're receptive to. This doesn't cut it anymore. At the same time, they're leaning in and saying, 62% of them are more likely to purchase from a brand if they deliver value to them at the end of the day. Content that's relevant, content that has a purpose and brings something to the table. So this is where that value equation comes in. If you can truly act as an authentic brand and be in spaces where you're worthy to play and build trust with consumers, again, back to this trust thing, I think we're going to keep hearing it again and again. And then if you can build a really strong consumer experience that is personalized, to Sam's point earlier in the whole panel we just saw, it's enjoyable, it's frictionless, we're removing any extra work from consumer experience. If we can do this, we can actually start to build these successful relationships with consumers because we're bringing value at the end of the day.
Absolutely, and unlocking that value equation is a key role that we're working through from a strategic perspective to make sure that we understand the value equation that every single brand is operating under, and that we can start to unlock the levers that we can pull with media to start to do that. So there's a number of immediate actions. We've already been talking a lot today. It's a little bit overwhelming, but we wanted to give you some of the things that we could start doing right now to start overcoming some of these challenges, to start delivering more personalized messages and start thinking holistically and building those experiences that ultimately capture attention. And the first one, and we probably sound like a broken record, I've been saying this every year since I've been coming up here is to know your consumers. And what's interesting to me about that is that we keep saying it, and at the same time, our ability to know consumers is continuing to grow, and we have now the ability to really understand them on an individual level. The second thing is to really start to prioritize behavior. Jeremy said it as he was sharing those examples of AI, but really prioritizing behavior over technology is a critical aspect of building those successful holistic media experiences. And the last thing is, and importantly, is to structure for agility. So, you know, seriously, I'm up here every year talking about knowing your consumers. You know, I can't underscore how important it is for us to know who they are, what they are saying, and how they are saying it. The really wonderful thing, and the thing that I'm most excited about today, is that we have a greater ability to understand those people than ever before. We have a tool called M1. How many people in here are familiar with M1 or have used it? Fantastic. It is a game changer for us. M1 is built on a platform called DataSource. DataSource has PII data on over 280 million people in the United States. We're rolling this out on a global level. There's 30 different data sources included, for everything from the US Postal Service to Visa credit card data to Oracle Knowledge Base. And as well as our legacy CCS platform, which gives us 16,000 different motivational and attitudinal statements on how people are consuming media. It's an incredibly powerful platform for us. As a strategist, it's a truly game changer because it now allows us to really understand who people are, where they live, how they are spending their money, and most importantly for us, how they are consuming media. It changes the game for us from strategically and from a communications planning standpoint, but we're also now able to activate against this data as well. And we'll show you a case study later this afternoon on how we're able to do that. But now, for the first time, we're really able to understand people as individuals. We're understand them not as a cookie or as a proxy. We're really starting to understand who these people are as individuals and start to create audience segments based on things that we haven't been able to do before. We're not looking at demographics. We're not looking at even consumption patterns. We're starting to find large swaths of groups of people that are lumped together based on their actual behavior. And that is, for us, that's a distinct difference.
And that's a perfect lead-in to the second key takeaway, is really prioritizing behavior. Two really great quotes from the VP of Innovation at Netflix. The first is just calling out the fact that a consumer isn't necessarily who they might look like from a demographic, psychographic perspective, right? There's 19-year-olds who watch Dance Moms, 73-year-olds watching Breaking Bad. It's not always what it seems. And so it's incredibly important to understand that consumer behavior. But when it comes to us making decisions as brands and us making decisions and guiding you as you make yours, how do we think about the behavior instead of technology? There might be a new technology out that's new, cool, and sexy. It's the buzzword of the quarter. But will that really pay off with your consumer? Are they even in that space? Are they engaging there? And then you really think about consumer behavior and how it's changed over time. This is very similar to something Jeremy put up earlier, talking about how consumer behavior has changed from something as simple as typing to then texting, to voice, to motion, proximity. As our behaviors have changed over time, it's not necessarily the action that matters, it's the emotion behind it. It's what's driving that. And how can we start to wrap our minds around that as we think about the consumers we're advertising to and speaking with and building these relationships with, and start to think about it more in that regard. And then what is the action that's driven off the back of that emotion, excuse me.
So the last thing, and this is probably one of the most critical things, and it's the easiest thing for us all to do, is to start to structure for agility. As Jeremy said this morning, the only thing that's for sure is that disruptions will happen. The only thing that is for sure is that our plans probably won't work. So if we're structuring for agility, it allows us to adjust to those disruptions. It allows us to account for plans that don't necessarily pay off or plans that don't necessarily work. And ultimately, it allows us to take advantage of all the opportunity to drive innovation, to drive our level of personalization, to help create new products that make customers' lives easier, build our relationships and drive those tangible business outcomes. The really cool thing is, as all of these wonderful things that we've talked about, the cost of entry is lower than ever, and the risk, the impact of risk is minimal. So as we think about what we heard from Don and what we can do from a cloud perspective, as we think about the impact of AI, as we think about our ability to integrate apps across platforms and really start to understand consumers, as we think about how that connectivity is going to continue to proliferate, those all represent really powerful opportunities, and it's never been easier for us to talk about or as brands to take advantage of those things. I think it was really interesting as we think about the ethics of AI, as we think about where consumers are shifting their attention, as we start to lose trust in once trusted organizations, we look for that in other places, and there's a real opportunity for brands to take a lead as we think about innovation, as we think about the ethics of AI, and start to really build products that are not just benefiting the brand themselves, but benefiting society. And the more that we're able to do that by structuring for agility, the more successful we will be as brands. The interesting thing, and this is not a surprise to anyone, there's 25 quintillion bytes of data created every single day. Data is growing 4 times faster than the world economy. There is tons of data. What we spend most of our time thinking about is how we visualize that data. I mean, if I have to I love really beautiful dashboards. I love really, really beautiful charts. But it's not about the dashboards or the charts. It's the connections between the data themselves. It's making sure that that data is structured in a way that we can access it, that we can start to build those beautiful charts, and finding those connections between all the different databases that we have on a particular brand is really important, and making sure that everyone has access to that. This is just something from Forrester around building systems of insight. So what's really important is that we're really finding those relevant connection points, that we're making sure that every team, whether it's an above-the-line agency or a below-the-line agency or a creative agency, we all have access to the data we need to do our jobs, and that we're finding those relevant connection points, and we're structuring ourselves as an organization in ways to do that. It's part of the reason why we're expanding our communications planning team. It's part of the reason why we've developed a strategy team, and the more that we can start to build, and a big reason why we brought the data and the strategy teams together. So the more that we can continue to drive that, the more successful we'll be. And ultimately, our goal is to capture attention and meet expectations of consumers. And the best way for us to do that is to build those one-of-a-kind media plans at scale with prominence and precision. And that's the real trick of what we're getting at today. And that's what we think we have to be thinking about as media professionals. And we want to make sure that we have that prominence, that when we're investing large sums of money, that those plans have an impact, that media has an impact on individuals. But we also don't want to lose that sense of precision. We want to make sure that we're targeting individuals and we're communicating people on a one-to-one level, and that we're always focused on performance. No matter where we're investing those dollars, we're aware of what those tangible business outcomes are going to be. What are those KPIs that we're really striving for? And if we're able to do that at scale, we know that we will then capture attention and be successful in changing behavior and growing, and ultimately growing the business. So you started to hear a lot of this morning. As you go through the afternoon, you'll start to see more as Joel talks to us about how he attacks personalization and what personalization means to him. You'll start to see more of how we can tactically help you achieve this. As we learn more about M1 and we see how we've applied M1 to other brands, you'll start to see how we can start to apply this and ultimately start to bring these plans together. And then tomorrow, as we go through the Insight Labs, you'll even get a better sense of what we're able to do from a tactical perspective to start building these plans at prominence and scale. So thank you very much for the time. Again, welcome to Colorado. If you have questions for Jackie and I, we'll be around. If you have questions about Colorado and are staying around, I'm happy to answer those as well. It's always a great honor. And thank you, Jackie, for joining me today.
Thanks.
Thanks, guys.